Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 20, Communities and Ecosystems with me, Andrea Sharpenstein. Um, and this is our very last chapter for this semester. Okay, so first we're going to talk about biodiversity and how the human population threatens this. We just talked about ecosystems, and now we're going to talk about how the human population affects the ecosystem with different things like um, alien species, species mortality, species disturbances, ecosystem degradation, ecosystem conversion, and environmental contamination. And you can see all of these proportions just in this chart with agriculture, aquaculture, climate change, forestry, grazing, industrial development, mining, oil and gas, recreation, transportation and utility corridors, urban and rural development, and then water development. So just look at these different proportions here on your own time and see how we've affected it. This graph shows time on the x-axis, so right here, and it shows human populations in blue and extinctions in orange. You can see that the human population and the number of extinctions are highly correlated. As the number of humans rises, so does the number of extinctions, and that's a little bit crazy. Remember when we talked about trees and how they're so important within an ecosystem? Well, that's part of biodiversity. Healthy ecosystems are incredibly important, and to put it into a monetary perspective, they are worth about $33 trillion plus. Why are they worth so much? Well, these different systems, they purify water, they decompose waste, they recycle nutrients, they do what ecosystems should do. They also help us keep water in the system, they help soil, and they help everything function as it should. For example, we have wetlands. Wetlands act as buffers. They help protect coastlines or inland areas against different things like hurricanes, and they help control flooding by reducing the impact of flooding rivers. And wetlands, they also filter pollutants. When we talk about diversity, biodiversity, we're talking about genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. So 3 different parts. With genetic diversity, we're talking within a species, how many different alleles there are. And we've talked about this a lot, so we're not going to focus on genetic diversity in this chapter. Then we have species diversity, so all of the species that are around. And with ecosystem diversity, we just mean all of the different ecosystems. So we're going to focus on species and ecosystem diversity. Let's talk about species diversity first. Ecologists, or people who study ecology, believe isn't the right word. They can see that we are pushing species towards extinction faster than ever before. Today's rate of species loss, it's growing. Species losses are growing species extinction. Today's rate is 100 times higher than any other time in the past 100,000 years. By the end of this century, we'll have lost about half of all extant. Extant means living. So extant animals are still around today. Extinct means they're gone. But anyways, we'll have lost about half of all of our living plant and animal species. Throughout history, we've seen 5 mass extinction periods, and we are currently going through our 6th. So these arrows are pointing to 5 mass extinctions we've seen before. After each arrow, you'll notice these little rises, right? So rise, 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 rise. These are punctuated points of equilibrium in evolution. So remember, we talked about this a little bit, where a lot of evolution is happening to fill those different niches. So niches are occupied spaces that become available after the animals that occupied them die off during an extinction. So they open up for the animals that are around afterwards. When we say up here, when we say that about half will be lost, we're being optimistic. It's probably about 3/4 or 75% of species that will be lost during the sixth mass extinction, which is the one that we're currently going through. And that's it's a little bit depressing to think about. Two recent victims of human-caused extinctions are the Chinese river dolphin and golden toads. If you look up species going extinct, you'll find a lot of literature. And it's really, really sad, but everyone should be aware that this is going on. Ecosystem diversity is larger or higher level, where we look at different types of ecosystems like rainforests, coral reefs, deserts, and it's so important that these ecosystems stay healthy because they aid in so many different things that benefit us. They function in purifying our air and our water, and they regulate our climate, which is important. Remember all of our climate change discussions. They help with erosion, and they help so much more than we realize until they stop working, and then we definitely feel the effects. While they're working, we don't really realize all of the good that's happening. But there is a lot of good that's happening. So coral reefs are a type of ecosystem that have incredibly high species diversity in one area, but they're being destroyed in extremely high rates. So the Great Barrier Reef outside of Australia is slowly disappearing, and they tell you not to go because the reef will not benefit from us, touching it, looking at it, whatever. But at the same time, it's good to go to see it one last time because it'll disappear soon, regardless really of what we do, unfortunately. Some issues that happen with these destruction in coral reefs include coral bleaching. For more information on coral bleaching, you can check out NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They have their own website, and they go into details about coral bleaching. But I'll touch on it a little bit. What we're looking at in this slide is a healthy coral reef. Healthy coral have a type of algae called zooxanthellae, and they have a mutualistic relationship with each other, so both benefit. But if the coral gets stressed, then the algae leaves, and the coral gets this stark white color. And that's where the term coral bleaching comes from, because it really, really turns this very stark white color. Some stressors that could cause the coral to get stressed and expel this zooxanthellae include pollution, changes in oceanic temperature, so remember climate change, and then low tides. And all these impede the coral to get the nutrients that it needs. Human activities also cause stress to coral, so other than things like swimming and touching coral reefs, things like the aquatic fish trade, people will take fish out in enormous numbers to sell to different stores or buyers or pet stores or anything like that. They don't really look at population numbers to make sure they've left enough species there for healthy populations. They don't care. They're looking at monetary value. We've ID'd 4 main factors when it comes to the decline in biodiversity. Number 1 is habitat destruction and fragmentation. We just talked about this in the last chapter, so I won't really focus on that one. But we also have invasive species, we have overexploitation, and we have pollution. So let's discuss invasive species first. These are species that are introduced to new areas by us, by people, and they are not native to these areas, ergo why we call them invasive. And these invasive species affect our native species via competing with them for food, different resources, different reproducing areas or nests. And they also try to eat them. In other words, invasive will prey upon natives. And invasive species can parasitize native species. Some aquatic examples in this picture. The first one, we have an Asian carp. This is in Mississippi. And Asian carp can actually kill people by to the boat. and knocking the person out. It's kind of ridiculous to think about, but they can get very, very huge. In the second picture, we have zebra mussels. They're in the Great Lakes, and they've outcompeted other mussels. And they are natives. They are not natives. They are outcompeting the natives there. And then we have lionfish in Florida, and they are outcompeting other fish. And something interesting, if you catch lionfish in Florida, you can keep them and you can take as many out as you want. They are very, very invasive, and we want them out of there. So Florida is happy to see them go. So if you catch lionfish, you can go ahead and take them out. Be careful though, because the spines are toxic. All right, some more invasive species. Australia is pretty interesting. It has marsupials. So we're talking about this picture right now. These are not marsupials in this picture, but Australia has marsupials, and apparently introduced mammals can get super successful, like rabbits. So rabbits have become really, really successful in Australia. We also have these cane toads there. Cats are interesting. Cats can take out a lot of smaller species, like over 1 billion birds each year. To make up for this, to help our poor little birds, you can put a collar with a bell on your cat if you're letting your cat go outside, for example. Something else, we have Burmese pythons in Florida. So this started out as a pet, and a person who owned it released it when he or she didn't want it anymore, and that is bad. Don't ever do that, because that is how this invasive species got out, and it can go into somebody's house, end up in someone's pool. You've heard those stories. We have killer bees. Killer bees are similar to our bees, but way more defensive, aka they will attack more. And then we have starlings right here. Starlings are originally from Europe. They came to the United States because a group back in the day wanted to bring over all birds Shakespeare wrote about, and they released them in New York City, and we now have so many. And starling, like lionfish, you can take out. Doesn't matter. You can kill them, because they are definitely, there are way too many of them. Another way ecosystems can be disturbed is via overexploitation. So that's taking wildlife faster than the population can rebound. That's like the fish being taken out of the coral reef. Tigers are being taken out for their fur. American bison are being taken out for their meat faster than their populations can replenish. Galapagos tortoises, they have such a long generation time, and they reproduce extremely slowly. So people should not take out Galapagos tortoises. Rhinos are being killed for their horns. Elephants are getting killed for their tusks. And so much poaching is happening that rhinos may be extinct very soon. Another issue with rhinos, clicked too fast. Another issue with rhinos is that the land, with rhinos and elephants, is that the land they use and that they were used to roaming in has been decreased extremely, and they basically just have these national parks that they can roam in now. So they can't really migrate as far as they used to, and they don't have the space to really sustain their populations. And then pollution, of course, has a huge detrimental effect on different ecosystems, and oil spills are a big one that I won't go into too much, because we should all be pretty familiar with most recent oil spills that have occurred. Now onto community ecology, so species interacting, and we'll look at how they interact together. First, we have interspecific interactions that happen between different species. So inter means between specific species, and in this picture you can kind of see how different species are interacting with each other. These interspecific interactions between species can be classified as positive with a plus sign or negative minus sign. So you have negative interactions where both species are hurt and they're competing for resources. You have positive where both species benefit, so mutually beneficial. These are called mutualistic relationships. And then we have positive where one benefits and the other is harmed. So this happens in predation. So let's look at those different interactions. First, we have some competition where both species are harmed. This happens because there's overlap in their ecological niches. Ecological niches include biotic and abiotic factors of the space that these animals are inhabiting. So where animals get their water, where they nest, where they get their nutrients. If birds are using the same tree, for example, they'll compete. And when this happens, usually something called specialization takes place, where certain birds are only going to be in one area so that their niches don't overlap too much. This picture shows you different levels where different warblers are going to be on the same tree. If their niche is in the same spot, then one will win until the other leaves and finds a new niche or becomes extinct in that area. So specialization helps increase survivability and it helps decrease competition. The competitive exclusion principle states that if two species have an ecological niche that's too similar, they cannot coexist. So this is literally what I just talked about. An example is the Virginia's warbler versus the orange-crowned warbler. They go to the same places, but they use different areas. So the orange-crowned warbler is dominant, and it gets better areas because it's dominant, whereas the Virginia's warbler had to find a new niche, otherwise it would have gone extinct in the areas that the orange-crowned warbler was. In mutualism, we have a positive interaction where both species benefit. And this first picture is of a hermit crab with an anemone. Anemones are sessile, they do not move. The anemone protects the hermit crab, and the hermit crab helps the anemone by allowing it to dwell on it, and while the anemone is on the hermit crab, it gets moved as the hermit crab is moving, and it gets food that it normally wouldn't get. So hermit crab leftovers, if you will, the food that the hermit crab misses. And then in the second picture, we have a shark with a cleaner wrasse. Cleaner wrasse eat anything off sharks to keep them clean so that they don't have parasites, etc. So the shark gets cleaned, the cleaner wrasse gets fed. The third picture, remember mycorrhizae, the relationship between plant roots and fungi, that's mutualism. So I won't get into that because I already talked about that in a previous chapter. And then right below that, we have insects and flowers. So flowers give nectar to insects. In turn, insects pollinate. So they spread the pollen, and remember pollen is sperm, to other individuals so the plant can reproduce sexually. And then in this picture on the bottom left, we have oxpeckers, which are the birds on the back of this kudu. So for a long time, it was thought that oxpeckers ate parasites and insects off of the kudu, but really the oxpeckers are eating the scabs. So this isn't really mutualism, even though it was thought to be. Next, we have positive or predation, where prey is harmed. So first, let's look at crypsis, or cryptic coloration. This is a way for prey to hide from predators. In this picture, can you point out the animal? I mean, it's doing a pretty good job of hiding, and I don't know if you'd know this without me telling you, but this is actually an octopus right here, hiding. You can see its eye, and it's basically hiding underneath the sand, blending in with the sand. And then this right here is a cicada. It's blending in with the tree bark. Pretty good camouflage, huh? Alrighty, so in this picture, can you spot the animals? You can pause here if you want to search for them on your own before I tell you what and where they are. So I will give you 3, 2, 1 to pause. Okay, so in this first picture, we have a seahorse right here, hiding out. In the second picture, we have a giraffe, long, skinny giraffe. In this third picture, we have an alligator, it's a crocodile. Yeah, we have a crocodile in this picture. Crocodiles are sit and wait predators, so they use pretty fast bursts of energy whenever something gets near. And then this arrow is pointing this out. But this is a moth, and it looks just like the leaf during daylight hours. There's also something called warning coloration. This happens on possible prey items that warn the predator not to come by. So this first picture is of a blue-ringed octopus. It's small, it's toxic. When approached by a predator, for example, if we were to approach it, this blue-ringed octopus would try to flee. But if you don't let them flee, then the parts inside of the blue ring right here will turn brown and they'll bite you. Doesn't seem like a big deal. However, if they bite you, this will affect your sodium channels. So remember those from a previous chapter? If that happens, your muscles can't contract. So you can't breathe, your cardiac muscles can't contract, you go into cardiac arrest, and you die within minutes. It's insane how quickly this happens. Their venom, tetrodotoxin, is the same as in pufferfish. Another example, if a bird eats a monarch butterfly, it'll get sick and it'll learn to avoid those butterflies at all costs pretty quickly. And animals with warning colorations, they don't have to hide because they know predators won't eat them. All right, so we also see something called mimicry. Remember, birds won't eat monarchs because they'll get sick, right? Well, mimicry helps harmless species look like the harmful species. So on that track, birds won't eat viceroys because they look like monarchs. However, an issue that could come up would be if there are more viceroys than monarchs, birds wouldn't get sick if they eat the viceroys, right? So they would never learn to stay away from monarchs. So for viceroys to be successful, for this mimicry to work, their numbers have to be lower than monarch numbers because the birds have to associate them with monarchs to leave them alone. Another one, we have a milk snake versus a coral snake. So the milk snake's on the left, coral snake's on the right. The coral snake is highly venomous. Looking at them, I would probably stay away from both of them, but there is a fun little sing-song that goes around with this. So if you ever to encounter them in the wild, you'll know which one is venomous, which one is harmless. So we say red next to black, friendly Jack. Red next to yellow, deadly fellow. So coral snake has the red next to the yellow. The milk snake has the red next to the black. And the last one here is a pretty funny one. It's caterpillar that's supposed to be mimicking a snake. But you can see kind of, it's not doing a bad job. Alright, now let's look at some insect crypsis. This is pretty interesting. They can come up with some really elaborate disguises. Katydids look like leaves. So that's that first picture. That second picture is of a moth that looks like bird poop. And then we have different stick bugs that look like twigs. And they're really hard to pick out from an actual twig. Herbivory is technically predation. It's when animals eat plants or algae. Plants have evolved numerous defenses to prevent themselves from getting eaten through different spines, thorns, and chemical toxins. And some chemical toxins that we like include peppermints, cloves, and cinnamon. And all of these came about to deter herbivory. Another positive negative are parasites and pathogens. Parasites are animals that live on or in a host. So remember, we're hosts for tapeworm, and we've talked about tapeworm before. But this is so animals that live on or in a host from which they can get nutrients to survive and thrive. And then pathogens, these are things that cause disease. So bacteria, viruses, fungi, think fungal infections there. Protists, remember malaria is caused by a protist. And then you can read through this summary slide, but in short, in competition, nobody wins. In mutualism, both win or both benefit. And with predation, herbivory, parasites, and pathogens, one benefits and one is harmed. And all of these are different symbiotic relationships. A concept to mention is biological magnification. Whenever you go up a food chain level, you'll see more toxins accumulate. This is also called bioaccumulation. This happens when the first level takes in some toxin. So for example, DDT, the insecticide we talked about in a previous chapter, the next level will eat a lot of insects. It'll get more toxin in its system. Then the next level will eat more of the previous levels, and so on and so forth. And that's why when we eat a predatory fish, it has more mercury than a lower level fish. So a fish that eats other fish will have more mercury than a fish that eats plankton or something like that. Another example, PCPs, or polychlorinated biphenyls. These, I won't get into details, but these can happen from coolant runoff. So if a factory has some coolant runoff, it can get into the ecosystem, and each level we go up here, we can see more ppms or parts per million of PCB. So this is really not fun. And then eventually the most appear in the herring gill legs. So we start little with phytoplankton, get a little larger with zooplankton, larger with smelt, larger with lake trout, and then largest with herring gulls because they eat the fish, right? Right. So not fun. All right, so moving on to species diversity in communities. With this, we measure it in two ways. One, by species richness, how many different species there are in a community, and then two, how abundant are those species, how proportionally are they represented. Here are woodlands A and B. They have the same number of species, so you see 4 different species, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. But woodland B has more equal proportions of each. So you both have the same species richness, but woodland A has a relatively high abundance of one species over others, where in woodland B they're more equal. So keystone species are species that have a high impact on their environment, even though they're usually present in smaller numbers. They're called ecosystem engineers a lot of the time. So elephants will come by and they'll eat plants, and then they'll create pathways through the bush so that other animals can get through to other areas they wouldn't normally be able to get through to. Elephants also make dung, which is good for dung beetles. And they guard water holes, which is really important. And then we have a jaguar. It is a generalist. It preys on lots of different species, and it basically keeps mid-level species under control, keeps everything in balance. Beavers build dams. They change water flow. Sea stars, when sea stars are taken out, mussels overwhelm other species and take them out without being preyed upon by sea stars. So the mussels will overwhelm other species because sea stars aren't there to eat the mussels and control them. So without being preyed upon by sea stars, mussels will get out of control. Sea otters in the Pacific Northwest, there are a lot of kelp forests where sea urchins are very abundant and they like to eat this kelp. Sea otters, however, eat the urchins and keep those populations at a manageable level. But if the sea otters weren't there, the sea urchins would be decimating kelp forests because they wouldn't be getting preyed upon. We also have prairie dogs. So burrowing owls use old prairie dog dens as homes, and without prairie dog dens, these owls wouldn't have homes. However, prairie dogs are getting endangered now, which is really sad, but there are good conservation efforts to bring them back. So that's happening. And then we also have things called indicator species that tell us what's to come. Basically, we look at them to indicate when things are beginning to go wrong, because they're the first thing where it'll go wrong. So that's happening with amphibians right now, and it does not spell good news for our future. When we disturb an area, we can destroy organisms and or alter the availability of nutrients and water. It's usually and, not or. So really alter our resource availability. Fire, storms, droughts, people, all can alter an ecosystem. And we've talked about all these before. Here's a seasonal drought outlook of 2014. So you can kind of look through this, where the drought persists or intensifies. So California, out west. Moving on. Disturbances can cause previously unknown diseases to occur, like, for example, viruses in the Arctic were found to be 20,000 years old, and as that ice in the Arctic thaws, maybe those viruses will be released. This is another result of climate change, which is pretty scary. But on a happy note, disturbances can provide opportunities for other organisms to grow. So if a tall tree gets knocked down after a rainstorm, animals can find shelter and build homes for themselves. So that's nice. So that was a segment on communities. Now let's look at ecosystems some more. The ecosystem, that's those communities and the abiotic resource component of it. So energy flows through a system. It's put in by the sun and it flows through, whereas chemicals cycle. And we'll focus on nutrient cycles here in a second. Here's a figure of how energy is constantly being put in by light, whereas if you have a closed system, nutrients will cycle. So there will be chemical cycling of nutrients. So again, energy flows through and ultimately out of ecosystems, whereas chemicals are recycled within and between ecosystems. And all organisms require energy. They need it for growth, for maintenance, for reproduction, and in a lot of species for locomotion. So getting around, moving around. The biomass is the amount of organic material in an ecosystem. And primary production is the rate at which the producers convert solar energy to chemical energy. So different ecosystems have different primary production levels. The most productive, where we make the most biomass from sun energy, we have tropical rainforests as a number 2, close second. And our number 1 is coral reefs, which you really wouldn't think about, right? Because tropical rainforests, yeah, trees, rainforests, photosynthesis. But a lot of this is happening in coral reefs too, and it's pretty scary given what I just mentioned to you guys about coral reefs and how they're really getting depleted. But yeah, coral reefs are our number 1 primary producers. So moving on to ecological pyramids, food chains show us that energy flow that we just talked about. For example, a caterpillar eats a plant and it takes energy from a plant. And where does all of that energy go? Interestingly enough, if this caterpillar is eating 100 kilocalories, half of that, so 50 kilocalories, are coming out in its feces. 35 kilocalories are going towards cellular respiration, and then 15 are going towards growth. So out of 100, only 15 are going towards growth. So each level we go up the food chain, a lot of energy is getting removed from the system. Let's look at that pyramid of production by level by level. Producers here in both of these examples would be the corn. Vegetarians are primary consumers, so out of that corn, 10% of the energy is going to the growth of vegetarians. However, when you go up another level, 10%, so let's look at the second picture now, 10% goes to the corn, to the cow's growth. So then out of every 100 grams, you eat only 10% of that. So out of every 100 grams of meat of the cattle that you eat, only 10% of that is going into your growth. So from the corn, you're only getting 1%. Chemical cycling is important for ecosystems. So life depends on the recycling of chemicals. We've talked about this a lot. Nutrients are acquired and waste products are released by living organisms. At death, decomposers, so fungi, will return the complex molecules. They'll break them down and bring them back to the environment. And then the pool of inorganic nutrients is used by plants and then other producers to build new organic matter. So basically, plants take nutrients from soil, they get eaten by animals, animals die, get broken down by decomposers, and it's a smidge different for each different chemical cycling. So chemical cycling is also called biogeochemical cycling because they involve biotic, so living components, all these cycles do. And these form abiotic reservoirs, which is where chemicals accumulate or are stockpiled outside of living organisms. So that happens in our soil. So geological processes are abiotic reservoirs are in our soil. So first we have nutrients available to producers. Then we get producers taking in those nutrients. We get consumers taking in those nutrients from the producers, and then we cycle around to consumers dying, getting decomposed, going all the way back to abiotic reservoirs, and then starting all over again. And again, it doesn't have to go 1, 2, 3, 4. It can go from producer straight to decomposer, producer straight back to the abiotic reservoir. It just depends on what's going on in that system. So biogeochemical cycles, they can be local or they can be global. So nitrogen levels at your house versus global scale nitrogen levels on Earth. The three we'll look at are carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen cycles. Carbon cycles globally. It has an atmospheric reservoir, and we've talked a lot about carbon already. It moves between biotic and abiotic environments, where photosynthesis and cellular respiration will be pretty important. So refresher on photosynthesis. Plants take in carbon dioxide basically and make sugars. I won't get into too many details. We've basically talked a lot about photosynthesis in this class. But photosynthesis happens in the chloroplasts that convert sun energy to sugar, and then once the sugars are made, they get used during cellular respiration in the mitochondria to make ATP and to release carbon dioxide back out into the atmosphere. So this is a little summary slide. You can read through this on your own with photosynthesis and respiration. So we have carbon dioxide in the air, photosynthesis takes in that carbon dioxide. Plants get eaten or decomposed. Consumers also do cellular respiration. They release carbon dioxide. When they die, they go to the soil. They get decomposed. Carbon gets absorbed by plants or gets in air when burned, and it cycles all the way back through the atmosphere. And here's a little animation slide that you can look through on your own. And then we have phosphorus, which is important for teeth and bones, and in plants it's important for photosynthesis. So there's no atmospheric component to phosphorus, there's no gas. Phosphorus can move through plants and animals. It can get decomposed and either go to the water, rocks, or back to the plants. And then nitrogen. Nitrogen is also important for plants and animals. In plants, it's important for chlorophyll, so the part that takes in sun energy. And it has two abiotic reservoirs. It has an abiotic reservoir in the atmosphere and in the soil. And so most of the air that we breathe is actually nitrogen. Nitrogen fixers do nitrogen fixation. They take nitrogen gas, which is the main part of air that we breathe. Again, surprisingly, it's not oxygen, but nitrogen. And these nitrogen fixers turn nitrogen gas into nitrogen that plants can take in. So most of the nitrogen available in natural ecosystem comes from nitrogen fixing bacteria. Without nitrogen fixing bacteria, it would not happen as easily, for sure. I don't know what would happen actually, but it would not happen as easily. So you can look through this animation. But basically what's happening is nitrogen fixing bacteria is fixing that nitrogen into root nodules, which is allowing the plants to absorb it. And then that nitrogen is in the soil, it goes up through the roots, the plants take it in, the animals eat the plants, the animals die, they decompose, and it just all cycles through. Nitrogen is a super important ingredient in fertilizers. It's a really important component, as is phosphorus, which can have enormous effects on ecosystems. We're going to look at anthropogenic factors, or how humans can increase pollution in our aquatic ecosystems. And this happens when people over-fertilize their lawns or use too much insecticide or weed killer. It very quickly washes into our water reservoir. If one person does this, it's okay, it's not so bad, but because most people do this, it's become an issue. So this issue is called eutrophication, and this is basically when algae takes over. So this is, on this picture on the right, we have a normal lake, and then we have that same lake during eutrophication. And basically, this is when algae takes over, and this is why the Green River is green. Algae loves the nutrients. There'll be an algae bloom where it'll grow ridiculously fast. And while it's growing, it's using oxygen in the water, so fish that are living under it don't get much oxygen and they end up dying. I mean, look at the difference in those lakes. It's crazy, and this is definitely an issue in Kentucky, to put it into perspective. So water contamination and usage is another one. This is a picture of Lost River. Ooh, sorry. It's been contaminated in the past by local factories, and this diagram shows how this happens. So we live in an area with lots of limestone and caves. This is called a karst region. And everything we put in the ground runs down to our drinking water system. In order for us to be able to drink this, a lot of filters get put into place to clean it up. So a lot of filtration happens. Larger scale, let's look at the Mississippi River and all of the tributaries that lead into it. So the darker blue one is the Mississippi River. The lighter blue are the tributaries. When water eventually goes through this and gets into the Gulf, a dead zone happens due to all of that runoff that's accumulated so far and gets dumped into the Gulf of Mexico. It's a little bit ridiculous. So what can we do after things have gone poorly? This is where conservation and restoration biology comes in. Ecosystems have been altered, and we're definitely to blame. This is all due to human enterprises. So we're making efforts to find solutions and reverse the negative consequences of ecosystem alteration. Conservation is all about understanding and making sure that nothing gets worse. So understanding what's happening and trying to conserve it. Whereas restoration is an active role in finding solutions and reversing the issues. So they go hand in hand. Conservationists want to maintain areas. They want to maintain ecosystems. They want to work together to make communities of species viable. This picture has a wide assortment of areas to house different communities, for example, and conservationists want to maintain those natural areas. Landscape ecology looks at how we use land. So remember, we fragment our land and have more edges. Our species richness gets affected. Well, it can also change our soil and what's on the surface. So different plants, for example, that live there. And here you can definitely see the difference between natural edges versus edges made by humans. Movement corridors or bridges for wildlife to cross over. Animals actually do use these. So we built these narrow strips of suitable habitats that connect different isolated patches so that the animals wouldn't have to cross busy streets. And animals are actually using the bridges. It's pretty cool. We have these in Europe and Canada, and it's super helpful for animals not to run in front of cars. It's helpful for us, and it's helpful for the animals. Alright, so next we have bioremediation. So here plants are used to remove toxins from soil and water. Long-rooted plants are usually used. They were used in these pictures, and you can see how the water definitely looks a lot cleaner with the introduction of these plants. It just looks so much better. A restoration example is the Kissimmee River. Basically, they wanted to remove all of the dams and reservoirs to reestablish the river. You can read through this slide on your own time, but here's a picture of that. In the middle, notice how different the natural water flow looks with that dam removed. So this one right here has been removed, and notice how just the river looks so much different than it does over here. The plan is to remove more of these dams to restore that river, because that'll really, really help the ecosystem out a lot. Lastly, we'll talk about something very important, something for you to take home and think about. It's called sustainable development. Sustainability is using resources at a rate lower than or equal to what can be replenished naturally. So taking lumber out at a rate the forest can replenish instead of cutting down all the trees. It should be the goal of everyone to be more sustainable, because how else will we be able to use our resources if we just deplete them all? How would we even start this, though, on an individual level? So you need to be able to maintain the planet, the people, and the profit. So all of those together equal sustainability. We have to have sustainable development, we have to manage it, and we have to conserve Earth's resources. We are really dependent on continued research and new technology. We know the sun will keep giving us energy, and if we can harness it at a rate that we can replenish, solar energy would be just amazing. Understanding the ecology of an environment is important. So knowing how many fish to take out without causing crazy disruptions to the populations, so without over exploiting them, would be really good. And we need to connect this to people in economics. People wouldn't be taking exotic coral reef fish if there wasn't an economic need for them, aka money. Poaching wouldn't happen if there wasn't an economic need. So we need to come up with good alternatives for those people to make money, but it's hard, and a lot of it is about education again. So sustainable development aims to conserve biodiversity and to improve the human condition. And to improve the human condition, an easy one is to just get educated. Receive education, push people who are in more poverty-stricken areas to get educated, to decrease birth rates, and all these are important factors. Biophilia, which is life love, literally, it just means love of life. E.O. Wilson writes good popular science novels. But yeah, anyway, that was just a side note. Everyone likes looking at nature pictures, right? Everyone likes looking at cute pictures of animals. And a lot of you have nature backgrounds on your laptops right now. But basically, E.O. Wilson, he uses the term biophilia to just describe how we love to look at life in its many forms. Most biologists, and hopefully you, have a concept of this love of life and incorporate it where you can. We need to try to do the best we can to help the earth. It doesn't have to be a huge change. I wanted to leave you with, first I wanted to leave you with some pictures of me. So all of these are of me. The middle picture is of my little nugget of sunshine named Bingo. He's my cockatiel, and he is the best. But anyway, what I did want to leave you with, lastly, is Carl Sagan's A Pale Blue Dot. Basically, you see a dark screen with just the tiniest speck and an arrow pointing to it. And it's saying that little tiny speck is Earth. And no one will save that tiny little insignificant speck we call Earth. Except for us. We are the ones that have to take action. We are the ones that live here. And the way we do this is by spreading the word, by taking tiny steps, to increase sustainability, by recycling, just everything we've talked about so far. But that's it. I want to thank you guys and congratulate you on finishing this course and looking through all of these videos. It's been a pretty fun semester. All right, bye.